All right. I guess we are recording. Okay. So I'm creating a short video, a short summary video for our Sunday's class, which was held at 24th March 2019 from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. EST, actually EDT. Anyway, so this is the position that we had scheduled as a homework for lesson number 3, and this is the position that we reach at the end of lesson number 2. And the problem I gave to you guys was to analyze black's moves here, mostly the move king f7. I wanted you guys to look at the variations that arise after this position, after black plays king f7, and come up with two things. The one is, of course, the calculation. I wanted you to calculate white's alternatives and what happens after variations, after each of white's alternatives. Calculate the variations and come up eventually with an evaluation. At the end of each variation, we want to assign an evaluation. And there are only 3 kinds of evaluations at this point I expect from you guys. It's either white wins, black wins, or a draw. So for each of white's moves, I want you to assign an evaluation of what happens at the end of each variation: white wins, black wins, or a draw. Okay, let's analyze each of white's alternatives one by one, which we covered in the class. Okay, the first alternative here that we discussed was the move king d6. And after the move king d6, we saw king f6. And here, if white now plays e5, then black plays king f5. And this is a mutual zigzag position. This is a concept we briefly discussed in lesson 1, and also we repeated that in lesson 2. Mutual zigzag is a position where whoever it is to play, whose side its turn is to play, loses the game. So now, after black played king f5, it's white's turn to play, and whatever move white plays, he loses his pawn on e5, and consequentially loses the game. Just a sample variation: if he plays his king to c5, then black's king takes on e5. And I'm just going to assume that you know how to win this position. And if you don't know, I'd suggest a good resource like Google to look into how to win this position. And one key thing that I would mention here is that black is winning in this position. It's because white's king is cut out of play. He's not obstructing black's goals in any way. If the king was, say, on e3, right in front of black's king, and more importantly, in front of black's pawn, right on this file, then white would have had a chance of giving stubborn resistance, or at least defending this position. But since his king is way out on c5, this is a totally lost position. Okay, let's go back. So king d6 doesn't work. E5 is a very bad move. Obviously, white loses there after e5. And say he doesn't play e5, and if he just stays put, then he can play something like king d7, then black plays king e5. And black is now attacking white's pawn, but white can just keep on targeting black's pawn. And so if black takes white's pawn, that's obviously not what white wanted, but at least it's not losing this variation because now we can capture black's pawn. And the game is a draw. Because there are only kings left on the board. Okay, so we covered the first variation, which was king d6. The second variation that we covered was king c6. And after king c6, we saw the variation king f6, and now white plays king d6. So white takes like a bit of a longer route to come to the d6 square instead of coming to the d6 square in one move. And the reason for that is because now he wants the move here. He wants to pass the move to black. And so black is sort of forced here to make a committal decision. If the king goes on any of these three squares, then he's leaving his pawn on e6 behind, right? If he goes on any of these three squares, white will just take the pawn on e6. If he plays king f7, then white plays e5. And black has to again play a move where he has to give up his pawns, say something like king f8 or let's say king e8. And after that, white just takes the pawn on e6. And now we come back to our first lesson, which is king on the 6th rank. And we know that king on 6th rank and in the file of the pawn is always winning. The king is on 6th rank, and he's also on the file on which the pawn is, right? So it's ideally placed on this square, and whenever the king comes on this square, we always win. And if you have any questions as to how white wins, please go back to lesson number 1 for king on 6th rank. Anyway, so king f7 in this position, king f7 we discussed, it's obviously a bad move. I mean, well, it's definitely a bad move. But we don't know if it's forced. Black definitely loses here after e5. So let's try an alternative like e5 and see what happens here. So white just waits, king d5. And again, we see a very unique pattern where black's king is again forced to leave the black pawn. So he either has to go on either of these three squares or f7 or e7. And he loses, he has to give the pawn. And here really our second lesson kicks in, like the learnings we took from second lesson, which is king on the 5th rank. And that's one of the reasons why this problem, I picked this problem to discuss, to begin our series with. Because this problem really gives the problem solver a good chance to apply the first two lessons in practice and understand what's really going underneath the surface. So in second lesson, we discussed a very particular position. And in that position, the side whose turn to play matters a lot in the final evaluation of the game. So here, let's say if black plays king e7, then we reach the position in the second lesson. But here now it's black's turn to play. White just took the pawn on e5, and now it's black's turn to play, and that's where black is losing here. This is something we discussed in our second lesson. Black's turn to play. And therefore it's losing. So I'm just going to assign a plus minus separate here. And that is why the correct move here, the only move that draws here is king f7. This is a fantastic move. And the reason is that now if white takes the pawn on e5, then black plays king e7. And now it's the same position we reached before But the key difference is that it is white's turn to play. And therefore, the evaluation of this position is draw. So let's talk about the evaluations. So when I say something like the evaluation of this position is draw, I of course am assuming that it's a draw after a series of best moves from both sides. White plays best moves from here onwards. And in reply to those best moves by white, black is also putting up the best defense. He's also playing the best moves. So when both sides are playing equally good without any mistakes, the evaluation is a draw. That's what I mean. Okay, so we don't want to assume our opponent is playing bad chess. That's not really something we can count on. And this is a very standard practice of doing evaluations. You are assuming that both sides are playing the best moves, and that's how we come up with evaluations. In the previous variation, where it was black's turn to play, so say black played king e7, white takes king into e5. Now it's black's turn to play, right? And here, when I say that white is winning, what I mean is that white will win regardless of black playing the best moves. So black will play the best moves, and in return to those best moves, white will play his best moves. White should win. And again, if you have any questions or you don't understand why this position's evaluation changes based on whose turn it is to play, then I would refer you back to lesson number 2. Okay, so this is a very critical position that you will need to keep in mind in the ensuing lessons in further variations. Just put a diagram here. Okay, let's put a diagram here. Okay. So king f7, and then it's a draw. Then so we come back and we find out that after king d6, white either draws or wins, but it draws after black's best defense, and after king c6, white again draws after black's best defense. And so we try to look at the third option that white here has, which is e5, playing the pawn to e5. So we looked at these two alternatives, king d6 and king c6. We found that these two moves lead to a draw after black's best defense. So we're looking at the third option and checking if that leads to any that leads to a different result, if white can win the game or is it still a draw. So e5, and so after e5 we saw a couple of moves. The first one was obviously something like king e7. So if king e7, white just plays king c6. And this is a very interesting pattern which you will see repeatedly in our future lessons or in other positions we might be looking at, which is that here black's king is practically forced to give white like an encroachment. So white's king will encroach on black's pawn in a very forceful manner, and there is nothing black can do. So black has to play a move here. He has to play some move. Either has to take his king to any of these three squares or f7. Say he plays his king to f7, then white plays king d7, and black's king is now forced to go to some square and give up his pawn, and then white takes the pawn on e6, and again we see that the king is on the sixth rank. So once the king comes on the sixth rank, then he wins, right? That's what we know. Okay, so basically king e7 doesn't work. Then we looked at king g7. King g7, white just plays king d6. Black defends the pawn, and white just passes on the move to black. He just waits, and he passes on the move to black. So this aspect of the game, of the chess game, is very similar to tennis, where in tennis, players just pass on the ball in their opponent's court. They just return the ball in their opponent's court, and then the opponent has to decide what to do with that ball, whether to return it or just pass the ball and lose a point. And in the same way, white is playing king d7. Like he's just waiting. He's not doing anything here. He's just waiting for black to make a move. And black, and whatever move black makes, black can make all these four moves: king f8, king g8, king g7, king g6. Whatever he plays, he has to give up his pawn, and after that, white takes the pawn, and his king is again on the sixth rank, and he wins. So, okay, let's come back to the variation with e5. So e5, we saw king e7, we saw king g7, and then we looked at king g6. Sorry. And king g6 is black's best defense, in that black lays out some traps for white. So say if white rushes to take black's pawn with king d6. If white rushes with king d6, then black plays king f5. And this is again the same mutual zigzag position we saw earlier. And here it's white's turn to play, and white has to make either of these 5 moves, after which he loses his pawn and he loses the game. So black is basically winning here. So king d6, if white rushes, then white loses. If white plays hurries and plays king d6, then he loses. But there is something else that white can do, which is king c6. This is again the same concept of waiting. So king c6, and so what white is waiting for is for black's king to come to f5. So if black's king come to f5, then and only then white plays king d6, and now it's black's turn to play. So it's the same position, but it's the other side's turn to play, and we are seeing this repeatedly in our positions, that whose turn to play matters a lot. So most of the players always want it to be their turn to play, right? Because when it's your turn to play, you can go and do captures, or you can go and develop your pieces. But there is nothing wrong with that. But there are certain peculiar positions, such as this one, where if it's your turn to play, you lose. So the black player must be feeling very sad here, because it's his turn to play and he has to play his king to either of these 5 squares. Let's say something here, but then he just loses his pawn, and then white can just queen his pawn, right? Okay, so white waits with king c6, waiting for black's king to come to f5. So black also does the same trick. He waits with king g5. Very tricky. And again, he is hoping that white's king comes to d6. So if white plays his kings to d6, which would be a very bad decision, then black will play king f5 and black wins, right? Because it's white's turn to play. But white here plays a better move, which is king d7. So he attacks black's pawn, and black is forced to defend it with king f5. Right, so there is no other way black can defend his pawn. So he has to play king f5, and then and only then white plays king d6. So you can see we reached the same position, but the way we reached it is very different. and it involves the best moves only. White could have gone to d6 two moves earlier, but that would not have been uh, the correct move to do two moves earlier, because then he would have ended himself in a zugzwang. So pay attention to this aspect of calculation where you can reach the same position with different move orders, and that can affect your evaluations. Like if you are winning or losing the game, and this happens a lot in practical chess. All right, so let's go back to our original position. So after king c5, king f7, we looked at three moves, and of those three moves, e5 is the one that wins the game. So king f7 is pretty much a mistake in this position. So after king f7, e5 wins. And so we want to go back and look at other alternatives for black. So here I'd like to take a pause and just share my views on what calculation really is in chess. What calculation really means? It basically means that you have to look at so you have a bunch of alternatives in any given position. You have a couple of alternative moves that you can play. So in this position, black has three moves. He can play king f7, he can play king e7, or he can play king d7, right? So these are primarily the three moves which look good superficially. Empirically speaking, these moves look good. Of course, black can play his king to f8 or king to g8, but we can look at those, and those moves are also losing. But sometimes, as your instinct tells you that certain moves just look better, and you got to follow your instinct so that you can shape and sharpen it. Okay, so at least there are three good-looking alternatives. We are going to go with the second one. And so coming back to what calculation means is that you pick an alternative, you go deep into it, and you come up with a conclusion. So just reflect back on what we did with the alternative king f7. For each of so after king f7, we looked at each of the three moves that white could have played. The three good-looking moves. I think legally speaking, white can make 7 moves after king f7, but we just looked at 3 of them because, again, we are following our instincts. We are just trying to pick the moves which look good over the surface. And if they don't work out, we can always go back and look at the other alternatives, but we have to start somewhere. So we are starting with the quote-unquote good-looking moves. We try to see if we come up with a desired result, and if not, then we go back and pick another alternative and apply the same technique. So it's basically picking an alternative, going deep, and once you reach at the end of the variation, then do evaluation and then come back. And this is a recursive process that you just got to apply over and over and over again. You can get better at this kind of process with practice. And so let's try to look at another alternative here, which is king e7. So king e7, and white could play. White has, I guess, two alternatives. Let's say king e6 and e5, and let's say king d4. King d4 already looks pretty dubious because you're retreating your king, so I really don't want to do that. And there is another alternative, king b6, but then your king is going into empty space, so you don't know what it's doing there. And let's say if white plays king c6, then black can do the same thing, which is He comes king f6, try to attack white's pawn. So white comes to d6, and now white plays the and black black plays the same thing. e5, king d5, and king f7. Right. So this is the position we saw a few minutes back, and then we know that this is a draw. King f7, white takes, king e7, and then it's a draw. Okay, and so king c6 draws. So we look at other alternative, which is e5, and basically we see the same theme again, which is let's say black plays king d7. Then white goes the other way, but now he's just trying to push shoulder black's king away from the e6 pawn, right? So he away from the e6 pawn. So black has to make a move. He's just passing on the move to black, but each move black makes, it gives more territory to white's king. Say he plays king e7, white's king come to c6. Plays king f7, white's king come to d7. So we can already see that white's king is just forcing black king to give up the black pawn, and then the king is on 6th rank. So to conclude, after king e7, also the same move wins for white, which is e5. And so we go back and look at black's third alternative, which is king t7. And now let's say white plays the same thing, which is e5. If white plays e5 now, black is able to black plays king c7, and now this is this particular standoff between the two kings is called as opposition. A theme we'll be seeing in our future lessons, and which will come across very frequently in these types of positions. So king c7, and what this is a very good position for black because he's now stopping the white king from coming on to the 6th rank. So white's king is not able to come to the 6th rank. So let's say white tries to employ a technique we saw earlier, which is trying to bypass the black king, trying to come from the side. And in that case, so say if black plays king d7, then this is obviously a mistake. Then white's king can start encroaching into black's territory, right? And then now he'll just take black's e6 pawn, a variation which we saw earlier. But he has a much better move here, which is king b7. And again, this sort of opposition against the white king allows him to prevent white king's inquisition into black's territory. So he just keeps stopping the white king on the 6th rank. If he plays king b5, then king b7. So it's a draw by repetition. If the white king goes back, then black's king will come ahead. So that's something white doesn't want. So to summarize, the move king d7 after king c5, the move king d7 is black's best move, because this is the only move that gives him a draw. Right, so this is a draw by repetition. So we basically looked at the best moves by white and black in the variation starting with king c5. And so we want to go back and look at different alternatives for white. So we have looked at king c5. There are like 3 moves that are remaining. One is e5, king c4, and king b5. And we concluded our lesson with king b5 and asking what move black will play here. And that would be your homework for for this week, and we'll continue analyzing this position next week.